Okay, so today we will look at Jewish history. So let's review what we learned about Jewish history so far. Now remember that for most of human history, the Middle East has been the wealthiest part of the world. And as we discussed before, the Levant, especially Jerusalem, is the center of the world because it connects all the major civilizations, okay? You have Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and over here you have the Persians. And over here is the Mediterranean, okay? As you can see, basically all roads lead to Jerusalem. So whoever controls Jerusalem controls the major trade access point, which is the most profitable part of an empire. And so for these empires, it's always been a problem of how to keep Jerusalem under control because Jerusalem, whoever controls Jerusalem, can always choose to switch sides, right? So if Mesopotamia controls Jerusalem, what the Egyptians will do is bribe Jerusalem to switch sides. And this keeps on going over and over. And they tried many different techniques on how to control Jerusalem. The Babylonians tried to take captives, hostages, and that didn't really work as well. So the Babylonians decided to destroy Jerusalem, okay? And with it, the Israeli identity became splintered and scattered. And this is the Babylonian Empire. But eventually what happened is that the Babylonians will be conquered by the Persians. And the Persians will adopt a new technique to control Jerusalem, which is divide and rule. They will create the Jewish identity implanted in Jerusalem, and that will create conflict with the locals. And the Jews will not be forever loyal to Persia because they are a foreign entity within the Levant. And only by swearing loyalty to Persia can they maintain control over the Levant. And in return, the Persians will give the Jews financing to build their second temple. So at this point in history, a Jewish identity emerges, and there are three pillars to the identity that continues even today, okay? So the first pillar is they become a monotheistic religion which believes that Yahweh is the only God, and they're the chosen people of Yahweh because Yahweh had a covenant with Abraham. Yahweh promised Abraham that your people will control the promised land, okay? And the promised land extends from the Nile in Egypt to the Euphrates in Mesopotamia. Okay, that is the promised land. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is the Jews must follow the law of Moses because the law of Moses is the law of God, the Ten Commandments, right? And the law of Moses over time will be divided into the Torah, which is the written law, and the Talmud, which is the oral law. Okay, the Torah is basically the 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the third pillar is to use the Bible as the collective memory of the people. Okay, so the Jews believe the Bible, what happened in the Bible is literal. It is actually what happened. And by believing that the Bible is literal and true, then you become a Jew. Okay, and that's why the Jewish identity is very flexible. Okay, so at this point in history, when the Jews swear loyalty to Persia, there are some characteristics that will change over time. The first major characteristic is that the center of worship is in Jerusalem, the second temple. Okay, so if you're a Jewish person, you must make animal sacrifices to Yahweh, and therefore the Sadducees, these are hereditary priests, they are the ones who control the religion. Then there's very strict laws that govern how people behave. So for example, you must rest on Sabbath. You also cannot marry outside your religion. You must be circumcised, okay? So there are all these restrictions on how people behave. Over time, what will happen is that the Jews will expand across the world. A lot of Jews will work as mercenaries in Alexander the Great's army as he conquers Persia. And as the Hellenistic world comes into being, Jews will move around for economic opportunities, right? They'll work as officials, they'll work as artisans, they'll work as tradespeople, as merchants. And so they're scattered around the Hellenistic world. And as we discussed, at this point in history, the three major cultures that we've looked at, the Jewish culture, the Greek culture, and the Persian culture will merge together in a process we call synchronization. And that gives birth basically to Western civilization. Unfortunately, what happens is that over time, because the Jerusalem is so important, and because the Jews believe they are a special people who only worship the one true God, that will cause conflict with the Greeks. Okay? The Greeks also are very chauvinistic, very proud people who believe their culture is superior. And quite honestly, a lot of Jews will convert to the Hellenistic lifestyle. Okay? But this causes conflict. And ultimately, this will culminate in something called the Maccabean Revolt, where a certain group of Jews decide to rebel against the Greeks. And even though they're a minority, even though most Jews actually do not support them, because of their religious conviction, because of the will of God, they will triumph and they will establish the Maccabean kingdom. And this victory is celebrated today in something called the Hanukkah festival, okay? Hanukkah. And that's a celebration of the Maccabees' revolt against the Greeks. And the reason why is the Greeks wanted the Jews to celebrate their religion as well. They wanted to turn the Second Temple into a site to worship Greek gods. And so the fanatical Jews rebelled against that. Okay? All right. But this kingdom of the Maccabees will not last very long. Again, the problem is that Jerusalem, it is the nexus of empires. And so what will happen is the Romans will come and take control over this area. And the Romans are actually worse than the Greeks. The Romans are even more chauvinistic, more discriminatory towards the Jews. And this will launch three major wars between the Romans and the Jews. The entire Jewish diaspora will revolt against the Romans, and this will lead to many Jews being massacred because the Romans are vicious people. In the year 70, they burned down the Second Temple to destroy the morale of the Jews. And because they destroyed the Second Temple, this causes a shift in the Jewish religion. Because remember, at this point in history, the Second Temple is a site of Jewish worship. This is the house of God. This is where Yahweh lives, okay? So when the Second Temple is destroyed, what happened is that the Jews, many Jews will choose to convert to Christianity, okay? Because remember, we discussed how Paul created Christianity as a mechanism for Jews to still be Jews, but at the same time be Roman as well, okay? That's the idea of the Christian religion. But those who stay become much more fanatical. In fact, they develop a very messianic eschatological attitude, meaning the end of the world is coming, God is coming to destroy the Romans, and we must show our loyalty to God. And so they keep on the fight, even though they've lost the war against the Romans. They will go into the Arabian desert where they will incubate a new religion called Islam, and they will prophesy the coming of the Messiah, who will turn out to be Muhammad, right? So at this point in history, the Jews must leave Jerusalem because the Romans basically kicked them out, and their religion was splintered into many different factions. But the major characteristic is that they've gone from temple worship to worship of their law, okay, the law of Moses. And so the rabbis come into power. Before, it was the Sadducees, the priests who control the temple, who are in charge. Now it's the rabbis. The rabbis are basically the Pharisees, those who teach the oral law of Moses. Okay, so they become the new elite in the Jewish diaspora. And so as we discussed, a lot of Jews at this time convert to Christians. All the early Christians were Jews, okay? And as we discussed, what will happen is those Jews who are most fanatical, they will escape into the Arabian desert and they will incubate Islam. And eventually, Islam will conquer the world. And at this point, they feel as though they've achieved the Messianic age. And they have returned to Jerusalem. Now, the Jews believe that in the Messianic age, the Messiah will come, lead them to victory, bring all the Jews back to Jerusalem, and build the third temple and usher in the Messianic age. Okay, and that's what they believe happened. And so this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and this is meant to be the third temple. Over time, what will happen is they will change it to become a center of Islamic worship. But in the beginning, it was really the third temple. And so at this point, a lot of Jews convert to Islam as well, because they think that Muhammad is their Messiah. Okay, so a lot of Jews are converted to Christianity and Islam, but there are a lot of Jews who do not, and they settle throughout the world. Okay, let's look at Europe at this point. So what's happening in Europe is that Europe is becoming more and more Christian, but the Jews are allowed to stay. And what will happen over time is that they will be persecuted, massacred, and expelled from many different places in Europe. I'm not sure if you can see this map clearly, but the circles, okay, are places where there was at least one Jewish expulsion. So this is a terrible time for the Jews because they settle in on a place, they're trying to practice religion, and then after they've settled in, they're expelled by the people. So what does happen? Okay, well, what's happening is that the Jews come to an arrangement with the European nobility, okay? And there's a deal, there's a contract that's not written down, but it's understood. Basically, what the Jews agree to is they become slaves to nobility, okay? Because in the Christian religion, you're not allowed to charge interest. You're not allowed to make bank loans to peasants and charge interest. But that's the most profitable business you can get into, right? So you, as nobles, can't do it. What do? Well, you get the Jews to do it for you. But not only that, but you get the Jews to also manage your property. Jews are actually very good at industry and trade. There's a Jewish diaspora, right? So the Jews make very good merchants because they're able to access different networks around the world. That's very important if you're the elite. Also, the Jews can make loans to you for wars and stuff. Okay, and Jews are very good at finance. They're very good at medicine. Okay, so the Jews become very independent. They become a very important part of the European economy. Okay, and the last reason, which is the most problematic, is that the Jews are kept around as a scapegoat. Okay, so in our society, we have poor people. Why? To put fear into people, right? If you don't work hard in school, if you don't make a lot of money, you end up like poor and homeless, right? Well, in Catholic Europe, remember the Catholic Church is in charge at this point. The Catholic Church wanted to keep Jews around to scare the Christians and say, hey, if you don't believe in Jesus, you end up like the Jews, okay? And so what happens is that this arrangement is fine when the economy is good, but what happens when the economy is bad? What happens when people are angry? The Jews get blamed, right? Because the Jews are the ones who are loan sharks. The Jews are the ones who killed Jesus. The Jews are the ones who are causing all the spiritual pollution, right? And so this is the implicit contract made between the Jews and the European nobility. You're allowed to stay and make a lot of money, but when we need a scapegoat, you get blamed and you have to leave, okay, or possibly get massacred as well. So it's a terrible, terrible deal for the Jews, but they keep it because they want to practice their religion, okay? All right, so there's one place in Europe that is very friendly towards the Jews. And this is actually the wealthiest part of Europe. It's Spain, okay? At this point, it's controlled by the Muslims. And remember, the difference between the Muslims and the Catholics is the Catholics persecute the Jews because they think that the Jews killed Jesus. But the Muslims don't believe that. The Muslims believe that the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims are all one big family, okay? They are all descendants of Abraham. So the Jews and the Christians are treated very well in Spain, and Jews rise up very high within the Al-Andalus system, okay? Because they're very literate, they know the Bible very well. The Bible is a holy book. They have connections to the Jewish diaspora around the world, and they are extremely good at finance, okay? So the Jews prosper in this region. The problem is that over time, this region will be reconquered by the Christians. And now the Christians will continue to persecute the Jews and force Jews to convert, okay? So this is when the Jews, Christians, and Islams get along very well in Spain, okay? But in 1492, the Spanish will expel the Jews from Spain. You either convert or you leave, okay? And a lot convert and a lot go off to the Ottoman Empire, okay? And this was a traumatic event in Jewish history because they were extremely well established in Spain. They felt they were Spanish, and now suddenly they lost everything, okay? Now a lot did convert, and this caused a schism, a divide, schism within the Jewish religion. Those who converted and those who refused to convert now became bitter enemies, okay? Okay, so what will happen now is a lot of Jews choose to settle in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is a new nation, and because it's a new nation, they need a lot of people. So what they will do is they will have extremely tolerant policies towards the Jews. You're allowed to practice your own religion. So a lot of Jews from around the world settle in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and again, they thrive. They do extremely well. But the problem is that this area can be easily invaded, and because it becomes more wealthy, more people start to invade it from Sweden, from Russia, and so war breaks out. And a lot of Jews get killed. So it just gets worse and worse for the Jews. When they think they finally found a home, they have to suffer this persecution. So all this history creates a major crisis of faith among Jewish people, okay? And the three big questions is, the first law in the Jewish religion is do not worship false idols. That's the first law of the Ten Commandments. So why is it that Jews can convert to Christianity and Islam and not suffer any consequences? Okay, and why are so many Jews converting? If Yahweh is the true God and Yahweh demands complete obedience to Him, why is it okay to convert? Okay, that's a problem. Second problem is, what did Jews do wrong exactly to be persecuted and massacred like this? Yeah, okay, some Jews convert to Christianity and Islam, but go punish them, man. Why are the Jews who are loyal to Yahweh punished? That makes no sense, okay? And the third big question is, if Yahweh promised the Jews a homeland called the Promised Land, why don't they have it? Why are they kicked out? For hundreds of years, despite all the persecution, despite all the trauma, they've stayed loyal to Yahweh. So why is this happening? This creates a crisis of faith, okay? And so whenever there's a crisis of faith, Jews believe it is the end times. The world is coming to an end, and the Messiah is coming. Okay, so at this point in history, about the year 1600, there's this heavy anticipation of the coming of the Messiah. And so what will happen is that one man named Zebedee Zevi, who was born in the Ottoman Empire, he will declare himself the Messiah. Okay? And Zebedee Zevi is the equivalent of Jesus in the Jewish religion. Now, we don't actually know much about him. And the reason why is that what we know about him, a lot of information was written by his enemies, the rabbis. His followers are pretty secretive, okay? But one thing happened is this. Whenever you have a Messiah come, what the Messiah does is he's essentially a revolutionary. He's trying to overthrow the social order. Okay? And his major concern is, why are Jews being persecuted like this? And his answer is, because we're not practicing the true faith. What we have are all these laws created by the rabbis. But who are the rabbis? The rabbis are just a corrupt elite, like every priest class before. They're like the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church is a hierarchy, and so over time they become extremely corrupt. The rabbis don't really suffer that much persecution, right? So when Jews are massacred and persecuted, guess what, guys? It's usually not the Jewish elite that's massacred and persecuted, right? And also, the rabbis are the ones who are helping the European elite persecute the Jews, right? Because it is the rabbis that control the Jews, and to maintain control of the Jews, they come into these unfair agreements with the European nobility. So for Zabbai Zevi, the real problem is a hierarchy within the religion. The real problem are these laws that don't make any sense. Don't eat pork. So the Sabbath, right? Rest on Saturday. You're not convert to other religions. Doesn't make any sense. What should matter is your faith in God. If we are a people, if we are a family born of Abraham and we share one blood, then who cares what you dress like, what you look like? We're all one blood. The faith in your heart is what matters. And also, there should be no hierarchy. People should be free to choose their religion. People should be free to choose their own lifestyle. People should be free to choose their own laws. If God loves us, if there's a divine spark in us, then we should know what is right and what is wrong. Okay? So, there are three things that he does that's really important. The first and most important thing is he proposes an egalitarian society where men and women are all equal, where there's no more hierarchy, where the rabbis are not above you because the law doesn't exist anymore. Okay? What matters is your relationship to God. So in many ways, he's a proto-liberal and a proto-communist. Okay? He believes that the system designed as it is, where you must obey the rabbi, and we must await for the coming of the Messiah, who will take us back to Jerusalem. It's meant to defend the status quo. It's meant to make the Jews slaves to the nobility. Okay? So he's very much a proto-liberal and proto-communist. And we'll discuss his influence on modernity next class. Okay? That's the first thing I want you guys to remember. Second thing I want you guys to remember is that he ultimately converts to Islam. Okay? So when he announced himself as Messiah, 1 million Jews follow him because he's preaching a message of liberation, of equality, of freedom. And so 1 million Jews follow him. But then he does something that's really weird, which confuses people, which is he's supposed to, as a Messiah, take them to war against the Ottoman Empire and restore Jerusalem to the Jewish nation. But when he's confronted by the Sultan basically says to him, the turban or your head. The turban means you convert to Islam, or I will cut your head off. Zabbai Zevi converts to Islam. And I was like, why did he do that? And the reason why he did that is you need to understand, he's a Messiah who's come to redeem the Jews, right? You've got millions of Jews who, in the centuries, have converted to Christianity, to Islam. According to the rabbis, these people will burn in hell. But if they're all part of one family, if they all have the divine spark, then they must be redeemed as well before we can have heaven on earth. So Zabbai Zevi, what he does is, by converting, he sacrifices himself, just like Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross to redeem us from the original sin. He is now redeeming the Jews, all Jews, from the original sin of conversion. Okay? And so, by doing this, he's saying, it's okay to convert, guys. In fact, I've absolved you of the original sin with God, so now you can now be close with God. And therefore, you don't have to follow the laws anymore. Okay? The Messianic age has come, because you are the Messianic age now. So the last thing he suggests is the idea of justification by sin. Okay? And again, there's been a lot of misinterpretation that this just means that, oh, it's okay to break the laws now. Okay, in fact, Zabbai Zevi, he converts to Islam, he eats pork, and he has a lot of wild sex, okay? And so he breaks a lot of these laws. But what Zabdi Zevi is really saying is that in the Messianic age, the laws don't apply because we all have the wisdom in ourselves to follow our own laws. And by breaking the laws, what you're showing is your true faith in the Messiah, your true faith in God, your true faith in yourself. Okay? Because you're no longer constrained by rabbinic authority. Are we clear? Okay? So, this is the idea of Zabdi Zevi. What happens when he converts is most choose not to follow him. Most choose to go back to the rabbis who are his enemies. But there are 300 families who choose to convert with him. And these families are called the Domai. And guess what happens? The Domai will eventually come to control Turkey. Okay? This is Mustafa Ataturk, who is the founder of the Republic of Turkey. And he's a Domai, guys. Okay? So you can argue that today the Domai control Turkey.